Good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us here in person on Park Avenue or joining us online, it is my joy and delight to welcome you to the forum where each week we hold sacred conversations about the things that matter. And this morning, we're delighted to welcome our guest preacher for our 9 and 11 o'clock services, the Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman. Dr. Turman is Associate Professor of Theology, African American Religion, and African American Studies at Yale Divinity School. She's a graduate of Union Theological Seminary here in the city and is the author of Toward a Womanist Ethic of Incarnation, Black Bodies, the Black Church, and the Council of Chalcedon. She was, for 10 years, assistant minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church up in Harlem, and was one of the first women and the youngest woman to be ordained and serve the ordinances there. She serves as co-chair of the Black Theology group of the American Academy of Religion, and she was featured in Henry Louis Gates' 2021 documentary on the Black Church. Dr. Turman, thank you so much for being with us.
So glad to be here, Peter. Thank you.
When we talked about the title for today's forum, you gave me two options. You said Race, Women, and God, or Black Womanist Theological Imagination. And I just sort of put the two together and made one the title and one the subtitle.
Okay, fair.
And I think maybe the one word some folks in this room may not know, some will know, is womanist.
Yeah.
Can you define that for us? That's been so much of your work. What is womanism and why is it so important?
Sure. So womanism, in terms of its theological implications, is it takes Black women's lives and experiences, that is, the social indicators of race and gender and class in its origins, and now contemporarily race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, and so on and so forth, as the starting points, the intersections of those social indicators as the starting point for thinking about God, for thinking about who God is and how God calls us to be as human beings in the world. And it might sound odd that a standpoint like that would kind of have its own name and be deployed as a significant site of theological reflection and imagination. But when you consider that Black women were almost invisible within the context of the Theological Academy, certainly up until the mid-1980s, you will understand, or you might understand, the radicality of even contending that Black women have something to say about God and about who God is. And I will say further that feminism is a more, is probably a more recognized term, certainly in this context, right? We understand feminism to do something similar, right? It takes seriously the lives of women, and it privileges women's experiences as it relates to God and imagining who God is. Black women in the early to mid-1980s determined, however, that our white women counterparts in the Theological Academy, although they were certainly adamant about contending with gender injustice, could also be racist. And so we, as Black women, wanted to take that to task and to really make a claim that white women are not representative of all women and all women's experiences, and that it is really the intersection of gender with race and class and so on and so forth that makes the difference for Black women and other women of color. And so womanism, to answer your question in a more concise way, does just that. It takes the realities. Emily M. Towns, premier womanist theological ethicist, would say the flesh and blood realities of Black women and other women of color very seriously, and contends that those experiences, those realities, have something very significant and transformative to say about God for those who believe.
Is it fair to say that intersectionality is a good term to apply to this project?
Absolutely. And that's just what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is saying that, race alone is not sufficient. It is not a sufficient category to account for all that is happening in the world. And while race needs to be discussed and needs to be prioritized because specifically of its impact, its influence on all of modernity. I mean, the modern world is a racial project vis-a-vis the transatlantic slave trade, vis-a-vis indigenous genocide, and so on and so forth, right? We have to take race seriously, and it must be discussed. But race is always Peter. Race is always intersecting with other social indicators that are equally important. It is intersecting with gender, it is intersecting with class and economic realities, and it is intersecting with sexuality, it is intersecting with ability, it is intersecting with age or generationality. And so we need to always be thinking about the experiences and the life kind of the broad spectrum of lived experience, which is never kind of this univocal thing, but is always the sum of these intersecting realities. And so yes, womanism in that regard is very much an intersectional practice that resists thinking about people, especially Black people, in a one-dimensional way.
You spoke already about Dr. Towns, who I know is one of your teachers, was at Union and at Yale, and now as I think about to retire from Vanderbilt. I know you've been influenced also by people like Dolores Williams, Katie Cannon, names that most folks in this room may not know, but a name that most would know in this room is Alice Walker, who was very influential in the beginnings of womanism. Can you talk about her a little bit? Absolutely.
In fact, womanist religious thought and womanist theological reflection appropriates the term womanism or womanist from Alice Walker as she discusses it in her groundbreaking, her classic text, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose. And Alice Walker gives a 4-part definition of what womanism is, and she says it's a whole page. It's on, I think, page 4, Roman numeral 4, the front of the book, and she tells us what womanist is, right? And she explains that this term, and others throughout the years have taken their bite, their chance at explaining what womanism is. But she suggests to us that, womanism is, although it is in conversation with feminism, and there is some interesting crossover with feminism, it is also very distinct from feminism. She talks about womanism as what we would say in womanist religious reflection as traditionally communalist. So it is concerned with the community. It is concerned with, everyone in the community, not, yes, with Black women, but with, everybody else too. We want everybody to win. We want to see everyone flourish. It is radically subjective, however. And so within wanting to be part of the flourishing of all of the community, there is a prioritizing of Black women's lives and Black women's flourishing. It is rooted in, and all of this is emerging from Alice Walker's text, it is rooted in this idea of redemptive self-love. So in a world wherein Black women and Black people and, we can, the sexually minoritized, the poor, have been taught to conditioned, I should say, to despise themselves because they defy in their own in their own flesh the arbiters of power. That there ought to be an embrace of self-love, right? That we should love ourselves. And then finally, there is this critical engagement with those who are not Black women. So Alice Walker says, womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. In other words, it's a deeper shade of purple. It's a deeper conversation at those intersections. And so womanism, again, although centered in Black women's experiences, desires to be in conversation with those people who are not enfleshed as Black women or who do not understand themselves to be Black women, so that we might learn from each other, grow, and ultimately flourish.
You said purple, so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the color purple, which most people know Alice Walker by, and the color purple as a womanist text.
Yes, absolutely. So just a certain, just an aside, I digress for a moment, but pre-COVID, I would go and see the color purple on Broadway every month. I was like a color purple, I don't know what you even call it, but super fan. I was like there. It was just so moving, and I hope one day to get back to my Broadway days. But again, I digress. The color purple is a sacred text for most womanist theologians, religious thinkers. It is a text wherein Alice Walker invites us into kind of the interiority of Black women's lives, and it reveals the nuances, the secret places, the kind of hyper realities of what can happen, not what always happens, but what can happen for those persons who live as racial subordinates, gender subordinates, sexual subordinates, and economic subordinates. And so Toni Morrison writes in her essay, the name is slipping from me, but it will come to me. But the quote is this, literature, this is a paraphrase, literature helps us to name and identify those things are, and here's the quote, too terrible to relate, right? So sometimes it's the things that we live through, and this is all people, can sometimes be so fraught and so tragic and so traumatic that we can't even speak them. We can't bring words that make sense of what we've seen and experienced, right, in our lives. But literature kind of gives us a mirror, and it gives us some distance and allows us to see those things clearly and assess and understand more deeply and differently. And I think that the color purple, Alice Walker's text, does just that for so many Black women, that it allows us to tell a story about the intersection of race, gender, class, and sexual subordination that is all of our stories and none of our stories. And so it becomes purple is the womanist color, of course, and it also is the color of womanism, I should say, and it also just is kind of central sort of as a centering space, a sacred centering space for thinking about Black women's lives as saying something about God. And one more comment about that. If you have read the text or seen the play or the movie, although the text does this more clearly than the film, you will note that it's written in journal form. And so much of the text is the progenitor Seeley writing to God, right? And so the text is, it does so many brilliant things, but one of the things that it does in this very explicit but implicit way also is say that Black women, right, it makes a claim that Black women are talking to God. Black women are communicating with God. Black women pray through their circumstances. Black women, I mean, it's radical because typically, and Peter, I'm just, I got to be real here, right? When we think about theological power, when we think about theological voices, we typically think of white men, right? We typically don't think about others who might have access, others, even ourselves, right? Even ourselves who have access to God and can be, in intimate relationship with God. It's, and that the color purple says that this poor, just downtrodden Black woman is like, she knows God. And I think that it's a lesson to all of us about who has voice and who has theological capacity. That it's not just BART and Bootman and Moltmann and Schleiermacher and Kierkegaard and, right? And I mean, let's just, like, it's not just them, right? And when that is the table that we're served, there are a bunch of other people who are left invisible or erased altogether. And so I'm kind of off on a tangent here, but the color purple allows for us to think in these ways, and specifically to think about Black women in these very powerful and very radical ways.
Can you talk a little more about the vision of God that womanism provides? Walker's vision of God is transgressive in some ways. And kind of, I know that you wrote a book about the Council of Chalcedon, and you're focused on kind of bringing together womanism and kind of traditional Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity. But womanism also kind of pushes the edges of that at sometimes too.
Oh, not just sometimes. And I mean, I think that although I am the first and maybe only womanist to have written about Black women in conciliar tradition in the ways that I do, I'm very disruptive to it, right? It's not like just get on board, It's quite disruptive. Womanism, and this is right. Womanism is not homogenous, right? Black women are not all the same, and so for every womanist, right, theological perspective, things will shift slightly. I mean, the one thing that we tend as womanist theologians and womanist religious scholars to all hold in common is centering Black women's lives, Black women and Black women's realities, making that the starting point for our reflection. But the realities themselves look very different. And so my perspective is not necessarily going to be another Black woman's perspective. And there's more that could be said about that. But I guess generally speaking, our vision of God is, wow, there's so many. Okay, so for instance, Dolores Williams would say to us that God is partial and discriminating. It's a direct quote from her classic text, Sisters in the Wilderness. She would say that God is not a liberator, departing from more traditional forms of liberation theology that says God is a liberator. She said, God is not a liberator, God is partial, and God is discriminating. And she will point you to the text in the Bible to show that that is the case. She would also say that that the cross, which we are in the season of Lent and we are approaching Easter, that the cross is not to be glorified. So, right, all that carrying of the cross, we saw it today, in service, the carrying of the cross and the bowing and all, right? That should not happen, right? Because the cross is a symbol of violence. It is a symbol of torture and abuse. And if we glorify the cross, then we participate in the glorification of suffering. That's a paraphrase, right? I mean, this is, she has lots of documents explaining this thought, but that is just a small glimpse. Joanne Terrell, who is a systematic theologian out of Chicago Theological Seminary, also Union alum, Dolores Union alum, would say that, wait a minute, right? Wait, we need this cross. Right? She would say there's power in this cross because the cross shows us that God suffers with us, that God knows what we're going through. And God is with us. God is a co-sufferer with us. And in that way, there's a way that the cross is its own sacramental witness. And I say, well, cross, moss, boss. I say we need to attend to not so much the cross, but the bodies on the cross. And so for me, Jesus becomes so critical from my understanding of who God is and how God is and what God is doing, because Jesus is the body. Jesus is God in a body. And this body undergoes a bunch of things. And yes, the body undergoes suffering, but concomitant with suffering is also this other very divine thing happening at the same time. And so that there's an understanding that all is not suffering and blood and torture, right? But there's also something very, what is the word? Very life-giving, and something very affirming, something very whole and complete that is happening in broken situations, amidst broken bodies also. And so we have to look, God is both and. This is why Chalcedon becomes so critical, right? God is this both and, right? Same substance on both sides. And we need to attend to that both and in human realities. Yes, we might suffer, but amid suffering, there is also opportunity for great joy, right? For flourishing, for mediating between the tensions of life. And it is this mediating God that I always want to propose and lift up as a way into the multitude of human experience.
Since you began your academic career, we've had the Black Lives Matter movement, we've had #MeToo, where, we've tried to pay more attention to bodies, especially bodies in danger. I wonder how your academic work speaks to the time in which we're in and these battles that are being fought.
So my academic work sits right at the intersection of all of this. To be quite honest, the movement for Black freedom is continuous, right? And what I mean about that is we have to be able to understand how Black Lives Matter, right, is connected to the Black Power movement, is connected to the Civil Rights movement, is connected to the abolition movement, right? And so on and so forth. That although they are distinct, there is a continuous thread that connects them. And in doing that, we can recognize that, Black people, lynching didn't start with George Floyd, right? Even though this is when, Fortune 500 companies woke up, they're back to sleep. But, in certain ways, right? Like people started paying attention. Oh my goodness, we see this on camera that, this man's knee is on this man's neck and he's, killing him right in front of us. Yes. And thank God for, awakenings. That's not the first time. Okay. And so this, and it hasn't been the last, right? So this is the movement for affirming Black life and affirming Black life as evidence of the creativity of God has been going on since the very origins of slave religion. And so, right, because the project has the project has always been a project of Black lives mattering, the Black theological project, because essentially that's what we as theologians have been trying to say for centuries. And so, and I think what is novel in this century is the Me Too movement, although the Me Too movement is connected to the many iterations of feminism going back into the 18th century as well, 19th century, 1800s, 19th century. And so even there's continuity there as well. It just so happens that feminism, white feminism was racist in the 19th century, right? And still, someone said still is, and absolutely, right? And which is why womanism and Black feminism is a thing, right? So, so contemporarily with the Me Too movement, we see more representation across racial identities being included, right, in the discourse for justice for women. And so my work as a womanist, as someone who is thinking about race and gender and all of these other things, is situated right in that mix. It is completely connected to what is happening politically in the public square around the worth, the value inherently of Black people, of women, of sexual minorities. And I'm writing a book right now on violence against women, specifically in progressive Christianity, because we tend to want to hold up liberalism and kind of progressive and prophetic religion as kind of the beacon for the hope of the faith. And we poo-poo evangelicalism and like to equate it with kind of Christian nationalisms and things like that, which is not necessarily wrong, but is, I think, overstated. And what I want to say is even those of us who think we get this right, who think we get race right, who think we get gender right, fall really short. And so we have to always be thinking about how racism and sexism and other isms, homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, I mean, we can go down the list, are embedded even in our most progressive contexts that think, you know, oh, we're the saviors of the world. And so this book is looking, I'm holding up a mirror to the traditions that I belong to, progressive Christianity, prophetic Black Christianity, to say, we might get race right sometimes, but we are sorely lacking as it relates to gender. You know why? Because Me Too is happening in our churches all the time. And anti-Blackness and pigmentocracy is happening in Black churches too, not just white churches. And so we have to hold all of our contexts accountable to what's happening and try to support them in growing taller in God's grace.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about being a pioneer at Abyssinian and what that was like, because you were a student at Union at the same time.
Abyssinian was a remarkable context to kind of come of age in as a preacher, a pastor, and a theologian. It was remarkable because it was so interestingly diverse in numbers alone, pre-COVID, of course. And also, it was doing a new thing with inviting women to the table, right? And so I always say that I could not be the theologian that I am today without having a community in which to serve, because the community gives substance to the God talk, right, that I contend for. I say this, I just did this podcast, and I said, all these podcasters are calling me, they want to talk to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this podcast thing? Anyway, so I did this podcast, and I said, theology without the people, it doesn't matter, right? Theology comes alive. What we say about God comes alive amidst the community. It is embodied, it is in flesh, and oftentimes it's the community that's living the theology that the theologian will espouse in context that the community will never be in, because there's only like 12 people who are locked inside, offices, at Oxford who are listening. So, right, and so for me, not every theologian believes this, but I am at my heart a liberation theologian, and I truly believe that kind of coming into theological voice as a young woman, as a Black woman in a what was then and continues to be in many ways a traditionally patriarchal context, but in the richness, the cultural wealth of Harlem, has given my theological voice the dynamism, the spirit of truth-telling, and the multidimensionality that I think makes it so breathtaking, but breathtaking in the sense of, oh my God, did she really say that? In the Theological Academy. And that could not have developed locked in a carrel somewhere in a library. It could only have happened with the people and in the streets. Yeah.
I know you're not the only person that ministered at Abyssinian while attending Union. That was a common pairing, and another person who did that is the senator from Georgia,
yes,
Raphael
my
Warnock.
brother, yes.
I know you interviewed him for your book. I wonder what that's been like for you to see him now as an ordained minister and a senator and pastoring at the same time.
Well, Senator Warnock, who I just call Raphael, is my brother. He is my brother, and just kind of fundamentally, I'm so proud of him, and I'm so invested in his success and in his and in his prophetic witness. It's hard to be a prophet and a politician. And so I am proud of my brother, and I support him, and I do think of all who are represented in the Senate, all who are in the Senate, he stands among the best of them, if not head and shoulders above them. And so there is that, It's not only what he has said publicly as a kind of politician and a public theologian, but is knowing him in a personal way also that affirms that claim. And yet I will continue to, I will say, and also his commitment to the Black church that he holds in tandem with his call to public service is to be lauded. At the same time, I think I am one of a few folks, there are a few of us, but one of a few folks who, many of us with lineage that traces back to Union Seminary, who can hold him accountable in the lion's den, because that's where he is during the week, and can also not just hold him accountable, but pray for him. Because he believes in prayer. We know that prayer changes things. And so there are a lot of feelings, a lot of mixed feelings. but among them are pride, wonder, inspiration, and hope, and, kind of just wait and see, waiting for my time to say, excuse me, Raphael, what's happening here? Let's get this together. Let's pull this back. Let's remember who we are. So as of right now, he is doing a wonderful job, and I couldn't be more excited for his trajectory.
We have just a few minutes. If you have questions for Dr. Turman, I believe Conrad Tinney is here with question cards. And so if you're in the room and you have a question, just raise your hand and he'll bring one around to you. If you're online, you can write your question into the live chat function on YouTube, to the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. While we're waiting for the questions, I'm wondering, you spoke about how even those of us who think we're so progressive and so open don't always get it right. And this is a place that thinks of itself as a progressive and open place. And I'm wondering, you spent so much time in the Black church, but you're also teaching now Episcopalians and Congregationalists and people in majority white contexts. What can these majority white churches, how can they responsibly participate in the conversation and in the work?
Wow, Peter, there's so many directions I could go for that. And I will say except for 1 year when I taught at a historically Black theological institution, I've always taught at PWIs. So this is, this is not new territory for me. I think one of the easiest and most challenging things that white folks, is that what you're asking about, white folks? Okay.
I guess, yeah.
That white folks can do is listen. And we are not good. I'm white folks, but we, I will say generally, are not good at listening. And listening, because you said, well, who should we listen to? We're all white here. Listening can come in many forms, right? It can come through reading. It can come through invitations. It can come through the kinds of contexts we allow for in our churches or in our private lives, our conversation partners, right? I think white people need to listen, and they need to open themselves to remembering, as Katie Geneva Cannon would say, what they never knew. Remembering those things that have always been there, but have never been seen. It's like I said with George Floyd. This is not the first. Lynching didn't just start happening in the 21st century. It's been happening for all of the modern world, right? We need to, white people should first start to listen and to tap into seeing those things that they know but they never knew. And that's a starting point. Because when you're equipped with a certain kind of knowledge, you can't stay stupid forever. It's just impossible. I should say stuck on stupid. Right? And so I think that listening requires an investment. It requires an investment, and it also requires openness, and it also requires a surrender of power and authority, and a recognition that there is something else to be learned and someone else who is the center of that knowledge field. I think that's a starting point. You can't, I have experienced predominantly white religious Christian context where, the big thing is we need more diversity. We need more whoever, more Black people, more Latinx people, more Asian people to be with us because we want to be their friends and we want them here. But there's been no interior work done about why those other people don't want to be there, right? And so you can't say you want to be friends with someone, but actually despise them for unknown reasons. So I think it begins with some interior work. My good friend Jennifer Harvey is a professor at Drake University. She's now, I think, the assistant provost at Drake University. And she used to do these, what she called anti-white racism spaces. And they were just for white people. And at first I was like, what? No Black people can come? It's just for white people? What do you mean? She was like, no, we have to do our own work. We have to get ourselves right before we can actually authentically connect. And I know she's right about that. And so I think that's a place to start.
So someone asked if you can speak to the backlash we've seen in recent years. I know you spoke about critical race theory briefly in the sermon this morning, but 2016 as just one example of how that, January 6th, of how that backlash happens.
It pains me because when you say January 6th, I just remember watching it and some of you probably as well. I remember watching it happening on TV, and I thought, oh my God, this is the lynch mob that I have read about. And there were actually nooses, right, being hung on. I was like, I read about this, and I heard about this. This is what my grandparents talked about. Oh my gosh, it's right here. It's on TV. It's happening right now in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol. And I remember experiencing all the ancestors kind of well up in my spirit. And it was a very challenging time for me, and I'm sure for many of us. There's always been a backlash. If we think about history, there's always been a backlash to Black flourishing, right? We saw it. Lynching didn't take off until after emancipation, right? And then kind of lynching soared. That's also when we saw the rise of what we now know as the prison industrial complex. Black criminalization did not become a thing until Black people were free. And there had to be, I talked about that a little bit in the sermon too, right? And there had to be a mechanism to restrict Black freedom. And so the birth of, incarcerating Black people for all kinds of non-reasons. And we saw the civil rights movement. We've seen this happen as a response to some of the gains of the civil rights movement, and we saw it, of course, in what William Barber calls the third Reconstruction, in the following Obama's election to the presidency. Right, we see this backlash. So the Bible says there is nothing new under the sun. We have been here before. And I think what it tells me is the claim I just made, as much progress as we have made. We have made progress, but it's not as much as we think, right? Because we are still living in a time of deep racial antagonism and frustration and violence and so on and so forth. I think that we have to get, and this is why theological seminaries and divinity schools, I think, are so critical. Aside from, our colleges of arts and sciences, because what we have to get a handle on, I think, is the Christian nationalism and its fascist tentacles that allow us to believe that, or segments of our population around the world. We saw this in Germany. We see, this is not, it's not new, that allow us to believe that God really wants one type of people to rule all others, to suppress all others, And that's the way God has ordained it. We have given this character to God when Scripture and the Spirit reveal to us that that is not the character of God. That is not the attribute of God. God is an inclusivity. And I think, when you think about January 6th particularly, and when you think, there were crosses next to those nooses and flags. And so what the Theological Academy has the capacity to do in light of this surge of Christian nationalism that really is driving the current kind of temperature of our public square, even for people who claim non-theism, right, or atheism. It's this kind of civic religion that requires someone else to be demonized so that others can remain centrally humanized. The Theological Academy has the capacity, if they are willing, to completely dismantle that sort of demonic theological imagination, to dismantle it, to destroy it, and to help reimagine or help people think about God and Christ, which is what my book does, in very different ways. To understand God as an inclusivity to which all are invited to access. And that does not require the subordination, the subjection of one group in order to lift another. And that's at the heart of it, right? In my opinion. And so I think as the church and as the Theological Academy, we still have a great work to do.
We're already over time, and I've got to get you ready to preach.
No.
I'm going to try to fit one question really quickly in there.
I told you I'm chatty.
In the context of womanism, what advice would you give a young mixed-race girl as to how to talk to God?
Well, womanism takes the experiences of Black women as the starting point for thinking about our God talk. And the experiences of Black women, like I said earlier, are not homogeneous. And so even though my Black woman experience might look different from her Black woman experience, might look different from her Black woman, for as much as that is the case, this person who is asking the question might understand herself as a mixed-race Black woman whose experience is continuous and diverges from the experiences of other Black women. And so I would say, understanding yourself as a mixed-race Black woman, that your talking to God begins with you. What do you have to say to God as it emerges from your circumstances? And you have to believe that God is able to meet you in your mixed race identity, right? Which is based on the historical realities of the nation of the U.S. I'm not sure where she's writing in from, but of the U.S. is certainly a Black identity. But you have something to say to God. And so you don't have to pray through, for instance, a white man or woman. You don't have to access God through the texts of the classical, traditional modern theologians. You can use your voice your experiences, and your prayer closet, wherever that may be, whether it's in the church, whether it's in your home, whether it's in the club. Yes, I did say that, right? Your prayer closet to talk to God and to access God's reality for your life.
Dr. Turman, it's been a real blessing to have you with us this morning.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here too. In just a few minutes, we'll be in the church, and Dr. Turman will be offering the sermon as part of our 11 o'clock service. I hope that whether you're here in person with us or online, you'll join us for that. And join us next week as we continue our Women's Voices in the Church series with Dr. Caroline Walker Bynum, a retired professor at Columbia University.